The radio crackled with static and panic. Forward operating Base Crimson had stopped transmitting 3 hours ago, and the silence from the valley wasn't the kind that promised sleep. It was the kind that swallowed men whole. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale stood in the operations center at Bagram, staring at satellite imagery that showed nothing useful through the dust and thermals. 52 American soldiers had gone dark in a valley that maps still called contested, but everyone knew belonged to someone else now. The last transmission had been fragments of gunfire and someone screaming coordinates that made no tactical sense. 3 QRF helicopters had turned back after taking fire from positions that shouldn't have existed. An AC-130 gunship had burned half its ammunition into hillsides that seemed to swallow the rounds without complaint. And now the sun was setting over the Hindu Kush, and Hale was looking at options that all ended the same way. That's when Captain Vieira Casque walked into the briefing room wearing a flight suit that had seen better decades, and carrying a helmet bag most pilots would have thrown away after their first deployment. She was 41 years old and had been flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II since before half the soldiers at Crimson were born. Her call sign was Gravedigger, earned in the first month of Iraqi freedom when she put 30mm rounds into a cemetery where Republican Guard had fortified themselves between the headstones. The name had stuck for 2 decades and 3 wars, and it had followed her through assignments that kept getting quieter and farther from anything that mattered. Now she flew training missions and babysat airspace while younger pilots got the real work. She hadn't fired her gun in anger in 4 years. Hale looked at her like she was a wrong number. The mission coordinator, a major whose name tape read Briggs, actually laughed. Just a short bark of disbelief that he tried to cover with a cough. Casque had expected that. She'd been expecting it for most of her career. She set her helmet bag down on the briefing table with a thud that suggested it weighed more than it should, and looked at the satellite imagery without waiting for permission. Hale started to speak, but she cut him off with a single sentence that carried the weight of 20 years in the cockpit. "I can get them out." The room went quiet. Outside, the rotors of returning helicopters chopped the air into pieces. Somewhere in the operations center, a printer hummed. Briggs exchanged a glance with Hale that said everything about what they thought of a middle-aged pilot nobody had asked for, offering solutions to a problem that had already beaten their best assets. Casque didn't look at either of them. She was studying the terrain, her eyes moving across the valleys and ridgelines with the kind of focus that suggested she was seeing something they weren't. Her finger traced a route that made Hale's chest tighten because it went through airspace they'd already written off as suicide. "That's a no-fly corridor," Hale said. "We lost 2 birds in there yesterday." Casque's finger didn't stop moving. "You lost helicopters, different machine, different fight." Briggs leaned forward, his voice carrying skepticism like a weapon. "The A-10 isn't exactly known for mountain flying. That's Apache country, and they couldn't punch through." "The Warthog goes where I point it," Casque said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that made both men pause. "And I've been pointing it at bad ideas for long enough to know which ones work." She looked up from the map and her eyes were the color of Baltic ice in winter. "How long until full dark?" 90 minutes, Hale said. He was still trying to figure out how this conversation had gotten away from him. Casque had a reputation as a skilled pilot, but she'd been flying desk missions and training runs for years. The last time she'd been in real combat, the war had different enemies and different rules. And yet she was standing in his operations center drawing flight paths through terrain that had killed better pilots in newer aircraft with better support. It should have been absurd. Instead, it felt like watching someone solve a problem everyone else had been looking at wrong. "Then we're burning time," Casque said. She pulled a headset from her bag and checked the connection with practiced efficiency. "I need current positions of all friendly units, estimated enemy concentrations, and weather updates for the next 2 hours. And I need someone to spin up Razor 11 because she's been sitting cold for 3 days and she doesn't like that." Razor 11 was the designation for an A-10 that had been in service since the Reagan administration. It was older than most of the personnel on base and had a maintenance record that read like a horror novel. The crew chiefs called it the museum piece. Pilots who had to fly it called it worse. It was scheduled for retirement but kept getting extensions because newer aircraft kept getting diverted to different theaters. Kask had flown it for 6 months and knew its quirks the way a pianist knows a temperamental piano. She knew which instruments lied and which ones told the truth late. She knew the exact pitch of the engines when they were about to fail and the specific vibration that meant the hydraulics were thinking about giving up. She knew it was a terrible aircraft to take into the kind of fight waiting in that valley. She also knew it was the only one that had a chance. Hale made a decision that would either save 52 lives or add one more to the count. Get her spun up. You have one pass. If you can't extract them or suppress enough to get choppers in, you abort. Understood. Kask was already walking toward the door. Understood. Briggs waited until she was gone before turning to Hale. She's going to get herself killed flying that junk into a valley we can't even see into. Hale stared at the map. Probably, but everyone else already said they couldn't do it. At least she's saying she can. 20 minutes later, Kask was running her pre-flight check on an aircraft that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and bad decisions. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was never going to win beauty contests. It was built around a gun so large the aircraft was technically the accessory. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon took up most of the forward fuselage and fired 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate that sounded like the sky tearing in half. The wings were straight and utilitarian. The engine sat high in pods that looked like afterthoughts. The whole thing had the aesthetic of a flying bathtub designed by someone who hated elegance and loved violence. Kask ran her hand along the fuselage and felt the patches where mechanics had repaired damage from 3 different wars. This wasn't a fighter jet. It was a close air support platform built to get low and dirty and take punishment that would drop anything else from the sky. And right now, it was the only thing standing between 52 soldiers and a valley that wanted them dead. The crew chief, a sergeant named Ortiz who'd kept Razor 11 flying through sheer spite and midnight welding sessions, handed Kask her final systems check. She's as ready as she's going to be, Captain. But the number 2 engine is running hot and the targeting pod has been glitchy since Tuesday. When isn't it glitchy? Kask said. She was pulling on her harness and checking her survival vest. Ortiz had packed extra ammunition and a personal locator beacon that was newer than anything on the aircraft. He didn't mention it. Neither did she. They both knew what it meant to carry extra bailout gear into a valley the rescue teams couldn't reach. "You really think you can pull this off?" Ortiz asked. It wasn't doubt in his voice. It was something closer to hope, which was worse because hope expected answers. Kask looked at the mountains in the distance, their peaks catching the last sunlight while the valleys below filled with shadows that looked solid enough to land on. "I think those men have been alone long enough, and I think someone should have gone already." She climbed into the cockpit and settled into a seat that had molded itself to her shape over hundreds of hours. The instrument panel was a mix of analog gauges and digital displays that had been retrofitted sometime during the Bush administration. She ran through her startup sequence with the kind of muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. Engines spooling, hydraulics pressurizing, flight controls responding. The radio chatter in her headset was controlled chaos as the tower cleared her for departure, and the AWACS controller somewhere over Pakistan updated her on threat assessments that made the mission sound even worse than the briefing had suggested. She didn't acknowledge the warnings. She acknowledged her clearance and taxied toward a runway that pointed east toward mountains that had killed empires. The sun was a red smear on the horizon when she pushed the throttles forward and felt 12 tons of titanium and spite accelerate down the runway. The A-10 wasn't graceful taking off. It clawed its way into the air with all the elegance of a freight train attempting flight. But once it was airborne, it had a stubborn durability that made it beloved by the people it protected and feared by everyone it hunted. Cask pulled the stick back and climbed toward the first ridgeline, her altitude gaining in increments that felt too slow and her airspeed sitting in a range that would make a fighter pilot weep. She didn't care about speed. Speed didn't matter when you were planning to fly low enough to read the serial numbers on enemy weapons. What mattered was durability and firepower, and the willingness to fly into spaces where modern aircraft feared to go. The A-10 had all three. So did Cask. The AWACS controller came over the radio with an update that sounded like a eulogy. Gravedigger, be advised, we're showing multiple AAA sites along your route and possible MANPADS in the valley. Recommend you reconsider approach vector. Cask adjusted her heading and dropped lower, using the terrain to mask her approach. Negative, Sentry. I'm committed. Her voice was calm. She'd stopped being afraid of dying in aircraft sometime around her third deployment. Now she was just afraid of failing, which was worse because failure meant other people died instead of her. The valley appeared ahead like a mouth opening in the mountains. It was narrow and steep-sided and filled with the kind of darkness that made instruments lie. She could see muzzle flashes in the gathering dusk, small pops of light that marked where Fob Crimson was still fighting. They'd been holding that position for 8 hours against odds that should have crushed them in the first 30 minutes. She could see the smoke from burning vehicles and the distinctive pattern of tracers arcing up from positions that had overlapping fields of fire. Whoever had planned this ambush knew what they were doing. They'd turned a valley into a kill box and waited for Americans to walk into it. Cask checked her weapon systems and felt the familiar weight of the gun settle into her awareness. She had 1,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition, enough for approximately 16 seconds of continuous fire. The Maverick missiles under her wings were older than some of the soldiers she was trying to save. The targeting pod was indeed glitchy, flickering between thermal and daylight, with a stutter that suggested its components were held together by prayer and expired warranties. None of it mattered. She'd gone into worse situations with less, and the men on the ground didn't care if her equipment was vintage as long as it worked when she pulled the trigger. Crimson Actual, this is Gravedigger. Do you copy? She kept her transmission short and her voice level. The radio crackled with interference, and then a voice came back that sounded like it had been dragged through broken glass. Gravedigger, Crimson Actual, we copy. Where the hell did you come from? Bagram sent me to ruin someone's evening. What's your situation? Cask was already descending into the valley, her altitude dropping below the ridgeline and her airspeed settling into the range where the A-10 did its best work. She could see the firebase now, a cluster of HESCO barriers and sandbags surrounded by terrain that gave every advantage to the attackers. The enemy had positions on 3 sides with interlocking fire, and what looked like a mortar team setting up on the northern ridge. The only reason Crimson was still in the fight was because they had a handful of good NCOs, and the kind of desperate courage that came from having no other options. We're surrounded, taking fire from all sides. Casualty count is 19 wounded and climbing. We've got maybe 2 hours of ammunition left, and they're massing for another push. We need extraction or close air support, or preferably both. The voice belonged to a lieutenant whose name Cask didn't know but whose situation she understood completely. Copy that, Crimson. I'm going to make a pass and see who wants to have a conversation with 30 Mike. Mark your positions with IR strobes and keep your heads down. This is going to be loud. She armed the gun and felt the familiar vibration as the system came online. The GAU-8 was a weapon from a different era of warfare, designed when close air support meant flying low enough to see faces and slow enough to put rounds exactly where they needed to go. Modern fighters launched missiles from miles away and called it precision. The A-10 got close enough to smell the gunpowder and made precision personal. Cask rolled the aircraft into a dive that would have made a safety officer file paperwork and lined up her first target, a machine gun position that had been chewing up Crimson's western perimeter. The targeting reticle settled over the position, and she pressed the trigger. The sound of the GAU-8 firing wasn't really a sound at all. It was a physical force that traveled through the airframe and made the whole aircraft shudder. BRRRRRT. 2 seconds of fire that sent 80 rounds downrange at a velocity that turned the depleted uranium penetrators into instruments of absolute erasure. The machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of dust and fragmentation. Cask pulled up and rolled left, already looking for her next target. Tracers arced up toward her from positions she hadn't seen, the gunners adjusting to her presence and trying to lead her turn. She ignored them. The A-10's titanium bathtub cockpit could take hits that would down other aircraft, and right now she was more concerned with the mortar team on the ridge than the small arms fire stitching across her path. She came around for another pass and put a Maverick missile into the mortar position with a precision that came from 20 years of practice. The explosion was bright enough to leave afterimages, and when the smoke cleared, the ridge was noticeably quieter. The radio erupted with voices from Crimson Actual, a mix of disbelief and desperate hope that made Cask's chest tight. She'd forgotten what this felt like. This immediate and visceral connection between her actions and the survival of people she'd never met. Training missions didn't have this. Desk assignments didn't have this. This was the reason she'd learned to fly in the first place, and somewhere in the intervening years she'd let herself forget. Gravedigger, you just bought us breathing room. They're falling back on the eastern approach. Can you hit them while they're moving? Cask was already lining up the shot. I can hit them anywhere they want to be. Call your wounded and get ready to move them to the LZ. I'm going to keep these people busy while you extract. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in close air support delivered by someone who'd forgotten more about the job than most pilots would ever learn. Cask worked the valley like a surgeon, putting rounds and missiles into positions with a precision that seemed impossible given her equipment and the conditions. She flew low enough that the soldiers at Crimson could read her aircraft number. She flew slow enough that enemy gunners had clear shots and took them, the impacts sounding like hail on a tin roof as rounds punched through the A-10's armored skin without finding anything critical. She worked the radio with calm efficiency, coordinating with Crimson Actual and the rescue helicopters that were finally vectoring in now that someone had cleared a path. Her fuel was dropping and her ammunition was nearly gone, but she kept making passes, each one buying seconds that added up to survival for people who'd thought they were out of seconds to buy. A voice came over the command frequency that Cask recognized as hail. Gravedigger, we're showing significant damage to your aircraft. Recommend you egress and let the QRF finish the extraction. Cask checked her instruments and saw warning lights that suggested the aircraft disagreed with continued flight, but hadn't quite given up yet. Negative. I'm staying until everyone's out or I run out of things to shoot. Tell the QRF to hustle because I'm down to my last magazine. She made another pass, this time using just the gun because her missiles were gone and her rocket pods were empty. The BRRRRRT sound echoed off the valley walls, and she saw men running from positions they'd held all day, finally deciding that whatever they were being paid wasn't worth fighting someone who flew like they had a personal grudge against the concept of cover. The helicopters came in low and fast, their door gunners adding their own fire to the suppression as the wounded were loaded with the kind of speed that came from knowing you were in a window that could close any second. Cask circled overhead, her fuel gauge showing numbers that suggested she was flying on fumes and faith. She'd worry about getting home after everyone else was safe. That was the deal. That had always been the deal. Gravedigger, last bird is lifting off. Crimson is clear. You are cleared to egress. The relief in Hale's voice was audible even through the radio compression. Cask turned north and started climbing out of the valley that had tried very hard to kill her. The A-10 responded with the sluggish reluctance of a machine that had given everything it had and was running on components that should have failed hours ago. The number 2 engine was definitely overheating now, and the hydraulics were making noises that maintenance manuals described with words like catastrophic. She didn't care. The soldiers were out. The mission was complete. Everything else was just details about how she got home, and she dealt with worse landings than whatever was waiting at the other end of this flight. The sun had set completely by the time she coaxed Razor 11 back to Bagram. The tower guided her in with the kind of priority clearance usually reserved for aircraft that were actively on fire. She wasn't on fire yet, but the smoke trailing from her #2 engine suggested it was a possibility worth planning for. The landing was controlled violence, the aircraft hitting the runway hard enough to make the entire frame groan, and the brakes screaming as she fought to slow 12 tons of momentum with systems that really wanted to be doing anything else. She taxied to the maintenance area where Ortiz was waiting with a fire crew, and an expression that suggested he'd been watching her approach and making peace with the idea that his aircraft might not survive the landing. She shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for a moment, listening to the ticking of cooling metal and the sound of her own breathing. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady the whole flight. She'd stopped shaking in aircraft years ago, right around the time she'd stopped expecting to survive them. Now survival was just a bonus that came with doing the job right. She climbed out and dropped to the tarmac with legs that remembered how to hold weight even if they felt like they'd rather not. Ortiz was staring at the damage to Razor 11 with the expression of someone cataloging a disaster. "How bad?" Kask asked. "How bad?" Ortiz walked around the aircraft, his flashlight picking out holes and scorches and damage that by rights should have brought her down over the valley. "Captain, I count 37 separate impact points. The #2 engine is cooked. You've got hydraulic fluid leaking from 3 different systems, and I'm pretty sure this panel is only staying attached because it's afraid of disappointing you." He looked at her with something between awe and horror. "How the hell did you land this thing?" Kask pulled off her helmet and ran a hand through hair that was plastered to her skull with sweat. "Same way I always do, carefully and with low expectations." Hale arrived while the crew was still assessing the damage. He looked at Kask and then at the aircraft, and then back at Kask like he was trying to reconcile the quiet middle-aged pilot with the person who just flown a museum piece into a valley everyone else had written off. 52 soldiers made it out. All of them. Because you decided to ignore everyone who said it couldn't be done. "They said it couldn't be done safely," Kask corrected. "I never promised safe. I promised I'd get them out." Hale's expression shifted into something that might have been respect if he'd allowed himself to feel it. "The QRF commander wants to know why we didn't send you in first instead of waiting until we'd tried everything else." Kask looked at the mountains where the valley was now quiet and dark, and filled with people who'd learned that the old aircraft and the old pilot weren't as obsolete as everyone assumed. Because nobody asks for Gravedigger until they've run out of other options. That's kind of how this works. She walked to the debriefing alone because that's how it always worked after missions that mattered. The questions were standard. The answers were precise. She laid out her actions and decisions with the clinical efficiency of someone describing a routine training exercise rather than a desperate rescue that should have ended in a fireball and a crater. The intelligence officers wanted to know about enemy positions. The operations staff wanted to know about the terrain. Nobody asked her how it felt to be the difference between 52 people living or dying. That wasn't the kind of question that appeared in after-action reports. But it was the question that mattered, and the answer was something Kask carried alone, because there wasn't really anyone else who understood the weight of being the last option, the desperate play, the pilot who got called when everything else had failed and failure meant body bags instead of second chances. She slept for 4 hours in a bunk that smelled like old canvas and dust. When she woke up, there was a message from Hale asking her to report to operations. She went, expecting paperwork or maybe a reprimand for breaking half the safety regulations in the manual. Instead, she found a briefing room full of people she didn't recognize, and a map showing terrain she knew too well. "We've got another situation," Hale said without preamble. "2 helicopters down in the Quarangle, heavy fire, no way to get extraction birds in without losing them too." He looked at her with eyes that had given up, pretending this wasn't exactly what he'd called her in for. "How's Razor 11? Ortiz says she'll fly again in about 3 weeks if we get parts, and a miracle." Cask studied the map and felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions settling over her shoulders. "But there are other A-10s on the flight line." "None of them have your pilot," Hale said. "The crews from Crimson are spreading word about what you did. I've got company commanders asking specifically for Gravedigger. They want the pilot who flies into places everyone else won't go." Cask felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. It wasn't quite respect yet, but it was close. It was the beginning of people realizing that the quiet pilot they'd overlooked for years might be exactly what they needed when everything else stopped working. "When do they need me overhead?" 30 minutes ago, Hale said, "but I'll settle for an hour from now." She flew 4 more missions that week. Each one was a variation on the same theme: Americans in trouble, terrain that made extraction impossible, and Cask putting an aging into spaces where it had no business being and making it work through skill and stubbornness, and a complete refusal to accept that some people were beyond saving. She took fire on every mission. She brought the aircraft back with new holes each time. Ortiz stopped being surprised and started just keeping a running tally of damage that he fixed with whatever parts he could scrounge, and a welding torch that got more use than it was designed for. The other pilots watched her with a mix of admiration and unease, because what she was doing looked insane right up until it worked, and then it looked like the only thing that ever made sense. The shift in how people treated her was subtle at first. The younger pilots started asking questions about technique instead of assuming she was obsolete. The mission planners started including her in briefings for operations that had nothing to do with her assigned duties. The soldiers who'd been at Crimson started telling stories that made her sound like something between a guardian angel and a vengeful deity, and those stories spread through the base with the speed of folklore. Gravedigger wasn't just a call sign anymore. It was becoming a legend, the pilot you wanted overhead when everything had gone to hell and the rulebook had stopped providing answers. 3 weeks after the Crimson extraction, Cask was sitting in the mess hall eating food that tasted like cardboard and regret when a young sergeant approached her table with the kind of hesitant reverence people usually reserved for meeting celebrities. He was maybe 22 and had a fresh bandage on his arm and eyes that had seen something he was still processing. "Captain Cask, I was at Crimson. I just wanted to say thank you for coming to get us, for not giving up." His voice cracked slightly on the last word and he looked embarrassed about it. Cask set down her fork and looked at him, really looked at him. He was someone's son and someone's friend, and he'd been minutes from becoming a statistic in a war that had already ground up too many people just like him. "You don't need to thank me. That's the job. That's always been the job." "Yeah, but nobody else did the job that day. Just you." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with whatever emotion was trying to work its way to the surface. "The guys in my unit, we've been saying we'd follow you anywhere, because we know you'd come for us, no matter what." After he left, Cask sat alone and stared at her tray. She'd spent 20 years being invisible, being overlooked, being the pilot nobody requested for the missions that mattered. And now she was becoming the pilot everyone wanted, not because she'd changed, but because circumstances had finally created a situation where her specific skills were exactly what was needed. She didn't know how to feel about that. Pride felt wrong because good people had to be in mortal danger for her value to be recognized. Bitterness felt wrong because they were recognizing it now, and that should count for something. So she settled on something simpler. She decided to just keep flying and keep bringing people home, and let other people worry about what it meant or what she represented. The work was what mattered. The work had always been what mattered. The missions continued. Some were close air support for troops in contact. Others were emergency extractions from zones that had turned hostile faster than the planning could adapt. A few were pure reconnaissance, flying into contested airspace to get eyes on targets that satellites couldn't see and drones couldn't reach. Kask flew them all with the same steady competence, her voice on the radio becoming something people listened for, a sign that someone who knew what they were doing was overhead, and things might actually work out. She collected damage and near misses and stories that other pilots told in briefings with a mix of admiration and disbelief. And through it all, she remained the same quiet, professional pilot she'd always been, neither seeking attention nor deflecting it, just doing the work and going home and getting ready for the next mission. 6 weeks after Crimson, a reporter embedded with one of the forward operating bases heard the stories and wanted an interview. Kask declined. The reporter persisted. Kask declined again. Hale eventually had to step in and explain that Gravedigger didn't do publicity because Gravedigger was too busy actually flying to waste time talking about flying. The reporter wrote the story anyway, based on interviews with soldiers who'd been under her protection and pilots who'd watched her work. The article called her the ghost of the Hindu Kush and described her flying as a blend of technical mastery and controlled fury that made experienced combat aviators shake their heads in appreciation. Kask never read it. She was too busy planning her next mission, a deep valley rescue that everyone agreed was suicide, but nobody could figure out how to avoid. That mission went like the others: impossible terrain, overwhelming enemy fire, an A-10 that had no business being where she put it, and soldiers walking away alive because someone had been willing to fly into hell and argue with the devil about return policies. The pattern was establishing itself. Gravedigger went where others couldn't, did what others wouldn't, and brought people home when all other options had failed. It should have gotten easier with repetition. Instead, it got harder because each mission raised the expectations and lowered the margin for error. People were counting on her now, not just hoping she'd show up but expecting it, certain that Gravedigger would find a way because Gravedigger always found a way. The pressure of that certainty was worse than enemy fire, because enemy fire you could dodge or armor against, but expectations just accumulated until the weight of them made every decision feel like it carried the mass of everyone who'd ever trusted you not to fail. She kept flying anyway, because that's what pilots did. You strapped into the aircraft and did the job and dealt with the fear and the pressure and the weight after you landed, in the quiet hours when nobody was watching and the adrenaline had worn off enough to let the doubts in. Kask had gotten good at managing those hours over 20 years of practice. She had routines and rituals that kept the darkness at bay. A letter she wrote to herself after each mission that she never sent, but kept in a folder that was getting thick with accumulated fear and survival. A photo she carried of the first crew she'd ever saved, back when her hair was darker and her hands shook after landing. A habit of touching the aircraft before each flight, a silent promise to the machine that she'd bring it home if it brought her home, a partnership between pilot and metal that had kept them both alive longer than probability suggested was reasonable. The war ground on. Seasons changed in the mountains, snow giving way to mud, giving way to dust that coated everything and got into places that mechanics swore should be sealed. Kask flew through all of it. Summer missions where the thin air made the already underpowered A-10 even more sluggish. Winter missions where ice formed on the canopy and made visibility a suggestion rather than a certainty. Spring missions through weather that changed minute by minute and made instrument flying feel like guesswork with expensive consequences. And through it all, the radio chatter followed the same pattern: units in trouble, requests for close air support, and then Gravedigger's calm voice cutting through the panic with the kind of competence that made people believe survival was possible even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Other pilots started studying her techniques, trying to understand how she consistently pulled off missions that by all rights should have ended in disaster. They analyzed her flight paths and her weapon employment and her communication style, looking for the secret that would let them replicate her success. What they didn't understand was that there was no secret. Kask flew the way she did because she'd been doing it so long that the aircraft had stopped being a machine she operated and started being an extension of her will. She knew the A-10's limits not from manuals, but from having pushed past them and survived. She knew what the aircraft could do because she'd done it, repeatedly, in conditions that made test pilots file safety reports. And she knew how to read a battlefield from the cockpit, because she'd been reading battlefields longer than some of her colleagues had been alive, accumulating a library of experience that let her see patterns and opportunities others missed. The respect she'd earned started solidifying into something more permanent. Promotions were mentioned. Awards were discussed. People who'd spent years looking past her suddenly wanted to know her opinions on doctrine and tactics. Kask accepted none of it with particular enthusiasm. She'd never flown for recognition. She'd flown because people needed flying done and she was good at it, and the rest was just noise that distracted from the work. But she understood that the noise mattered to other people, that the awards and ranks and recognition were how the military processed the fact that someone had done exceptional things and needed to be acknowledged. So she accepted the medals when they were pinned to her chest and said the appropriate words at the ceremonies, and then went back to the flight line where Ortiz was keeping Razor 11 alive through increasingly creative interpretations of the maintenance manual. "They're talking about giving you a newer bird," Ortiz said one afternoon while they were inspecting damage from the latest mission. "Something from this decade, with systems that work." Kask ran her hand along a patch of fresh rivets that held together a section of wing that had taken fire over Helmand, and put someone else in Razor 11. That was the idea, yeah. Ortiz looked at the aircraft with the complicated affection of someone who'd kept an impossible machine running against all reasonable expectations. "Though I'm not sure anyone else could fly her the way you do." "She's not special," Kask said. But she was lying and they both knew it. Razor 11 was special in the way old things that refuse to die become special, worn and patched and held together by accumulated repairs but still functional, still capable, still willing to go places newer and better things wouldn't dare. The aircraft had become Kask's partner in the truest sense, both of them outdated and underestimated and proving their worth through sheer stubborn competence. Putting her in a newer A-10 would be like changing dance partners after finally finding someone who knew all your moves. Technically, it might work better, but it wouldn't feel right. So she kept flying Razor 11, and Ortiz kept fixing it, and together they established a reputation that spread beyond Bagram, beyond Afghanistan, into the broader aviation community where pilots traded stories about the crazy things they'd seen. Gravedigger became a legend told in ready rooms and bars. The pilot who flew like rules were suggestions, and made it work through skill so profound it looked like magic. Some of the stories were true. Others were embellished beyond recognition. Kask didn't correct either kind. She just kept flying, because the work was never finished and people kept needing her overhead. 8 months into her deployment, she was called into Hale's office for a conversation that started with congratulations and ended with a knife in the ribs. "You're being promoted to major and rotated stateside," Hale said. His expression suggested he'd fought this decision and lost. "They want you training the next generation of A-10 pilots, passing on everything you've learned out here." Kask sat very still. "I'm needed here." "You're needed everywhere, and they've decided you'll do more good teaching others how to do what you do than doing it yourself." Hale's voice carried frustration that wasn't directed at her. "I tried to argue, told them you're worth 10 other pilots in this theater, but the decision came from high enough that my opinion doesn't change anything." "When?" Kask asked. The word came out flat. 2 weeks, enough time to finish your current missions and hand off to your replacement." Hale looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "For what it's worth, you've changed how people think about close air support, about what's possible. That matters." Kask stood and walked out without saying anything else. There wasn't anything to say. The military gave and the military took away, and you didn't get to choose which one happened when. She'd known this was coming eventually. Combat deployments ended. Wars wound down. and pilots who'd proven themselves valuable got rotated into positions where they could spread that value around. It made perfect sense from an institutional perspective. From a personal perspective, it felt like being benched in the middle of the game because you'd been playing too well. She flew her last 2 weeks like someone trying to pack a lifetime of flying into a handful of missions. Every takeoff was bittersweet. Every landing felt temporary. She said goodbye to places she'd never see again, and people she'd never fly with again, and an aircraft that would get a new pilot who wouldn't understand it the way she did. Ortiz took it hardest, losing both his pilot and his excuse for keeping Razor 11 in service. He gave her a patch he'd made, Gravedigger embroidered over a silhouette of an dropping through clouds, and told her that someone needed to remember what they'd done together when everyone else had given up. The flight home felt wrong. She was moving away from the fight, away from the people who needed her, toward a future that looked like safety but felt like surrender. The stateside assignment was prestigious. Training pilots was important work. She'd have influence over the next generation of close air support aviators and a chance to shape how they thought about the mission. It should have been exciting. Instead, it just felt like exile, like being removed from the place where she mattered and relocated to somewhere she could be managed and controlled, and prevented from taking the kinds of risks that made bureaucrats nervous. She taught for 3 years. She was good at it because she was good at most things involving aircraft. The students respected her because her combat record spoke louder than any lecture. She passed on techniques and hard-won lessons, and the kind of tactical wisdom that only came from having survived situations that should have been fatal. And every day she watched younger pilots learn to fly, and felt the weight of knowing they'd get to do the thing she'd been told she was too valuable to keep doing. It was necessary and important, and she hated every minute of it, because teaching people to fly into danger while staying safely on the ground felt like betraying everything she'd ever believed about what it meant to be a pilot. Then the war in Ukraine started, and everything changed again.